basically the idea was that me and Chuck were pretty much really only bass fishing. We weren't doing much trout fishing. We'd kind of got out of steelhead fishing, and we were pretty adamant and pretty passionate about sharing that with people and getting more and more people involved in it. And we're like, it's one thing to sit and talk and on the way home in the trucks and talk about how we want more people to bass fish. It's another thing like to do it. And so Chuck had this idea of let's put together the California Bass Union. Let's get some of our best buddies together, which you can see on the screen. Like if you go down that list, we basically asked our friends who would say yes when all it was an idea. It's and the idea is basically was, hey, we want to promote and grow bass fishing in the state of California and share with people what we're doing and what we're passionate about. So it's basically an educational kind of or outreach. I mean, a lot of those guys up there are guides, and so like we promote what we do as guides, but it's not an outfitter. There's no booking on our site. The site is pretty much exclusively educational with videos and blogs, and the main goal is to grow bass fishing with a fly rod. Chuck can jump in if he wants to add anything else, because it's definitely
I mean,
where
I was coming from, I mean, I'm up here and based in Grass Valley, California, surrounded by all these foothill lakes. And since I've lived here, I moved here in this area a little over 13 years ago, and I've pretty much been. I was fishing the lakes before I was, really tuning into any of the rivers really, and as I got more and more into fly fishing for bass, and then transitioned into guiding, I noticed along with our buddy Ryan Williams, who's a part of the union here, a lot of these foothill lakes are in a lot of ways kind of an untapped resource. It's catching on, has been catching on in the past few years, but for a long time, man, there was not a lot of people out doing what we do and doing it the way that we like to do it. And so it was, it was a challenge kind of selling those trips and getting people fired up on it, which again, it was another reason for starting the Bass Union and just kind of, bringing to light, how special a lot of these foothill fisheries are, especially, from the end of a fly rod. In a nutshell, that's where it started.
Well, right on. Let's do some introductions of who all's talking here, and we'll start with you, John.
Yeah, thanks, George. My name's John Sherman. I'm the West Coast rep for Simms Fishing Products, Solitude, Flies, Waterworks Lamson, and Hatch Outdoors. My first fish on a fly rod was when I was 8 years old, and it was a largemouth bass. So I didn't really make the conversion from trout to bass. I started with bass, and that was kind of my passion from the beginning. Let's see, I grew up in Visalia, California, where we had access to a lot of warm water fisheries and had to drive a ways to go trout fishing. So bass were kind of the local fish that we targeted, snuck into a lot of golf course ponds, totally dug that type of fishing. And that just was our closest quality fishing that I could do before I had a license. And then once I got my driver's license, the world opened up a bunch. I went to school up in Chico, did a ton of bass fishing while I was up there. In 1993, discovered stripers, caught my first Delta striper then. And in let's see, 2000, I moved up to Truckee. I was lived on the banks of the Truckee River, but found myself driving an hour and a half down the hill to go striper fishing because I was much more passionate about that, even with great trout fishing in my backyard. And then in 2005, I was involved in a group called Bass and Fly, and we started kind of a similar type of organization where we really wanted to grow the sport of fly fishing for bass. We started hosting the Bass and Fly tournament out in the Delta. And so I've been involved in these an organization like this for quite some time. And Chuck and Hogan reached out, a couple of years ago now, I guess, and I was honored to join. As you can see there, those are a couple of my social media sites. I've got at John G. Sherman, which is kind of my fishing photo site, and then at Fish CA is my rep business site. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm sure I missed something, but it's a quick hit.
Yeah, it's been cool watching you and Cassix going back to the roots and fishing the golf course the last couple of days.
That was good times. We had a blast doing that. It was cool for him. I mean, it's really rare right now to be able to fish the golf course ponds. I'm used to sneaking in on the no fishing side, running into the pond, making a few casts, and then running back out before I got busted. With all that's going on with COVID-19, the golf course is shut down. So we just rolled out my dad's golf cart and, fish prime time and catch some great fish at right during the middle of the day. So it was pretty fun. He got a lot better than I did.
That's awesome. Right on. Thanks, John. Chuck?
Yeah. So, I'm Chuck Ragan. Like I said, based in Grass Valley, California. I guide mostly striper and bass. But I row a boat on the Yuba and the Feather at times. The Yuba's basically our backyard. So I kind of do a number of different programs. I haven't been guiding.
Uh-oh, did we lose Chuck?
We lost Chuck.
Frozen picture of Chuck Ragan.
We'll see if we can get him back. Hogan, you want to?
Sure.
For just a moment. We can talk about Chuck if we don't get him back.
Yeah. No, my name's Hogan Brown. I grew up in Grass Valley, Nevada City area. I started guiding when I was 19 years old, working at a fly shop in Nevada City, California. And I was spending most of my time fishing the lower Yuba and the North Fork of the Yuba, and in the fly shop talking trout fishing all day, every day. And I really kind of got bored with it. And so I started searching out. There's a couple guys in the shop, Ralph Wood, and right around that same time, probably 20 years ago, I met John. And
what shop was this, Hogan?
Nevada City Anglers. It's long gone, but I started, like John, sneaking onto ponds when I wasn't guiding trout, and it was one of those things that I had so much more fun doing that than what I was doing trout fishing, that it just kind of stuck. And it was always kind of something that I did on my time off. And, through kind of my friendship with John was always made me feel that John, and later on in my career, I came up under Mike Costello. Both these guys kind of made me feel that it was okay to chase bass. And then coming up under Costello, he kind of, once Costello made the move to Delta stripers and bass, it was kind of the blueprint for how I was going to do things. And so I'd say for the last 15 years, I've been a striper and bass guide out of Chico, California. I don't row a boat much anymore. Probably the last 5 years, I've pretty much guided exclusively for stripers and bass. So that's me in a nutshell. Chuck's back.
You guys got me? I think
Chuck's back.
Something happened. I'm not sure. Been having issues. Yeah, but anyhow, what I was getting at is I run a lot of different programs, mostly to just stay working year round. And like we were saying before, we have spent a lot of time trying to kind of build the foothill bass fishing programs, and it's catching on. And it's gotten to where mostly, I'm guiding for bass and striper, and even more so kind of focused in, it's striper and spotted bass most of the time. But yeah, I work and fish, you know, on a lot of our Central Valley rivers, the Yuba, the Feather, the Sac mostly. And then we're surrounded by a ton of foothill lakes, beautiful lakes that we can talk about as this goes on. But yeah, you know, I love what I do. I love where I live, and I love taking people out and showing some of these places. And you know, like I was saying before, man, in a lot of ways, you know, I couldn't count the days that I've been out on the water where, you know, I was the only truck and trailer in the parking lot, and maybe see throughout the day, maybe see another boat or a handful of boats. And there's a lot of days like that, you know, and to me, it equates to, you know, a highly under pressured fishery at times.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love seeing what you guys are doing up there when all the rivers are blown out. I love seeing you all out there catching fish. It's pretty neat. You know, it's
get them. Yeah.
All right. So, you know, we've covered some of this. You know, if you feel like you have anything to add, you know, I know all of you guys are passionate about other types of fishing, and I think a lot of you kind of covered how and why you converted to bass fishing. But if there's anything you want to add on that topic, please do.
Me and Chuck were talking about this while we were driving today. Me and Chuck both, I think, probably converted. I think we've always fished for. We were talking about there's two kind of conversions. There's the conversion from a trout fisherman to a bass fisherman, and then there is the, I think, even harder trout guide to a bass guide.
Yeah,
that is, there's kind of two conversions that take place, but and we can get into some more of the specifics, but it converting from a trout guide to, or a trout fisherman to a bass fisherman is pretty challenging if you just are doing it within the context of the fly fishing world. You know, there's not a lot out there if you all of a sudden want to go, well, I just want to fish for bass. And that's kind of one of the hurdles that we ran into. And I'm sure John would equate this. John was really, and John would probably never toot his own horn, but John was one of the first guys to start hanging out with conventional bass anglers that I knew. And when John, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, started hanging out with guys like Bobby Barrick and Ish Monroe, and open up that can of resources, that was a game changer for me personally. In my conversion, was it opened up this whole new world of information. And when that world opened up, that's when the real conversion took place, I think, for me, getting out of kind of what I thought was possible, what I thought or learned was possible with a fly rod. There was so much more you could do once you started looking at that end of the operation. Yeah. So I don't know, Chuck may have something to add.
I mean, for me, you know, I was a conventional angler, you know, long before I ever got my head around fishing with a fly rod. And where I came from, I grew up in the Southeast. You know, I was born in Texas and went from Texas to Georgia to Tennessee to Louisiana, then down to Florida. And I was in Florida for about 18 years. And, you know, we fished everything from saltwater, freshwater, inshore, offshore. You know, we were all about it. And looking back on, honestly, my brother and I, we never realized like how good we really had it, you know, until we went somewhere else. But it was pretty incredible. And so, I mean, to me, coming out here, you know, I was already looking for bass, you know, before. And where I came from, I mean, we didn't fish for trout, like unless you're talking, good old specks, so inshore speckled trout. But I think the biggest conversion for me, if there were a conversion, when I started fishing with a fly rod for bass, I immediately just kind of stayed in that like spring, summer, early fall. Then the second it started getting really slow and really tough, I went back to, fishing, dredging, dragging worms and fishing slower, until, I started palling around with Ryan Williams, a fellow Bass Union member, and he may be watching this. He should be on this program right now, but he wanted to kick his feet up and drink beer and relax and just watch. But if you're out there, Ryan, anyhow, it wasn't until like I started fishing with Ryan throughout the winter, and we started doing this float and fly method a number of years ago. And it really just flipped my whole head around and made me look at winter and cold water fishing on it with a fly rod for bass in a completely different way. And that was a massive shift and conversion in like my thinking, my tactics, my schedule, everything that I work around and do when it comes to bass fishing. So
I just add, I love steelhead fishing to this day. I don't think I've converted away from it by any means. My kids are named after steelhead rivers, so it's still a super important part of my life, and love that type of fishing. George and I have had some great trips together. Steelhead is definitely a part of my game, and why not? You can do it all, right? You can do it both. You can love the steelhead fish, you can love the trout fish. But I think the bass thing, the thing that I've learned is, one, we've got the best bass fisheries here in the state of California, arguably in the world. Like, we have some of the top fisheries around Clear Lake. A lot of the stuff that Hogan and Chuck are doing, I'll let them name the lakes later. The Delta routinely is rated in the top 5 bass fisheries in the country, as is Clear Lake, rated by Bassmaster magazine. And for me, it's there's just so much to learn, and it's like it's uncharted territory. Whereas on the bass side, the conventional bass side, these guys have been competing for huge money for 30, 40 years. On the fly side, we just have a bunch of guys that would dabble in it seasonally. And I think that's what's most exciting to me is like we could still figure stuff out, learning different techniques and different tactics as we go. And we could do it at some of the top fisheries in the country that are right in our backyard. I mean, I live on the banks of the California Delta. It's a fishery that I'm passionate about. I love, and I can target 3 different species of black bass, and I can target, striped bass all in the same day. And so I think the proximity quality fishing, the size of the fish, the voracious predatory manner that they are. I mean, they eat trout. I tell people that all the time, you want to go catch trout. Well, here's a fish that the trout is a bait fish. This is what these giant bass eat trout, as do stripers. So I just think it allows us, especially on the striper side, it's basically like saltwater fishing, big predatory fishing in where we do it in a freshwater environment. So you don't have to rinse off your gear. You don't have to, scrub your boat down if you're using a boat. And so I think that's a big draw to me is the predatory nature of the fish, the way they crush the fly, the proximity to amazing fishing that we have in the northern part of California.
Right on. And I got kind of a follow-up question to that is, gear fishing is so productive for bass and stripers and all that. And why take it's kind of a 2-part question. Why take the fly approach to it? And then second part of that question is, do you see any conventional world guys noticing what might be possible from a fly standpoint in terms of catching bass?
I'll take that one first. I mean, I'm a fly guy. I sell a lot of bass equipment to bass guys by being the Sims rep. Sims launched into the bass world in 2012, and so that kind of put me in contact with some of the best bass anglers in the world. And I would say, and I've been fortunate. I was part of the film called Bass the Movie back in 2007. We filmed that. And in that regard, like they pitted a fly guy, which was often me, with a conventional guy, and I got to see their different tactics and techniques. And I would say in 90% of the scenarios that you run into, the gear rod is by far more effective. But there are situations and little windows where the fly is super productive, and we can hold our own with any conventional angler. I think that's on the, I would say, more the largemouth side of things. But on the fly side, or on the striper side of things, I mean, I've been on boats with some great gear anglers, and the fly outproduces, plugs, rip baits, you name it. In most scenarios, I think the fly for striped bass is even more productive. It's just a perfect fly rod game fish. Those fish live in shallow water. They're super aggressive to the fly. Very rarely do we ever have to fish over 20 feet deep. So, very accessible with fly equipment. And there's something about a clouser going up and down and how we strip that fly that stripers cannot resist. Now, I will say the really good gear guys consistently catch a lot bigger stripers than we do on average. I mean, I think they, this whole glide bait revolution that's happening, big top water, lunker punker type baits. I mean, they do consistently catch bigger fish than we do. But man, I'd put up numbers, that any of us here on this call against some of the top gear guys when it comes to striper fishing. I think we can hold our own, and in a lot of cases do a lot better.
Yeah. I'll add to that, going back to the black bass or spotted bass. In a lot of ways, conventional, most of the time, especially when you're talking about covering water, right? Conventional, you're always going to cover a little bit more, cover water faster conventionally over a fly rod, right? Until you get over to that float and fly method that we talk about and promote and all this, when you get to that, it actually switches, right? The float and fly method is an old school conventional method. Originally, that was basically came from crappie fishing. Charlie Knuckles popularized it in a lot of ways way back when, but when it began, those guys had to source longer rods to be able to cast that. So they found steelhead spinning rods from the Northwest that were 9.5 foot rods, where they were able to reel it back, flip it back, and go and throw a long 9 foot leader under a fixed indicator, fixed bobber, or whatever. Well, once you're out there, there's a whole method to it, where you're twitching it. You're not just staring at the bobber. There's a lot of methods to this madness. But my point is, when you're doing it conventionally, once you're there, the only thing you have is just that little kind of wrist flip, right? Wrist shake. And then you reel it back in, flip it back, go. Well, when you're doing it with a fly rod, you're actually able to cover water faster, in the sense where, say you're here and you want to move that fly, 15 feet, you can just couple strips, lift that thing and haul it over to your next spot, when your buddy next to you fishing the conventional rod has to reel that thing all the way back in, flip it back and cast. And that's about the only time that I know, conventional versus fly, that the fly can actually cover water quicker than a conventional method. But yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with Chuck and John, and I guide on the Sac for stripers pretty much 90% of my time, and that is essentially the the epicenter of the glide bait revolution. And the big advantage that those guys have with the conventional gear fishing side to stripers is I'm not even sure that those fish will hit a glide bait more than they will a fly. It's that guy's going to put his glide bait in front of more water and cover more water than I do with a fly rod. The big advantage.
You can't cast 300 feet.
Oh, easy. I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I got glide bait rods in my garage, and it's just covering water. I would agree with John 100%. Is a fly and striper, we're gonna outfish a gear guy pretty regularly.
Yeah.
Well, you guys have just turned everybody into glide bait anglers. I've got like 5 questions on it.
Oh yeah.
How do I get into that?
Yeah, we can answer those.
I'd say Google the glide bait.
You want me to? I'll just say what a glide bait is. Right. So it's a hard bodied bait that ranges in size. It's jointed at one point, usually kind of in the middle. And what the glide bait does is it slowly sinks just below the surface, and the angler can just sit there and crank with the bait caster, and the bait just does this under the water about 6 or 7 inches. There's different sizes, there's different imitations, different colors, but there's something.
Don't look it up, because once you see it, you'll lose all hope as a fly angler.
the way they move, I mean, there's something about that side to side S-type motion through the water that is just it's toxin to big fish and the predatory fish, largemouth and stripers.
Yeah. Some of them are about as big as the fish I'm holding on that screen right there.
Totally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, hold on, Chuck. I got a question about that fish. Were you striper fishing when you hooked that steelhead there?
Yeah, we were. That year we actually had quite a few of those fish. It was always a pretty special surprise.
That was 2 years ago, huh?
Yeah. We had a bunch that season.
Yeah, I did too. I remember that. You and me were both finding them.
Yeah.
Hey George, I got an important question for you. What beer are you drinking? I'm totally jealous here.
Phillipsburg Brewery, Montana IPA.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right.
2 down. He's always.
Hey, I should have stocked up. I'm drinking water here.
Yeah.
I didn't know if that was kosher. I was like, oh, do I have time? No, I'm just gonna go try.
Rookie webinar.
Yeah, right.
Might have to do a intermission or something.
Yeah.
Werewolf killer.
We can, if we time it right, we can make that happen. So let's see here. All right, so I think we covered a lot of this, but that's a massive striper that John caught. John caught a lot of massive fish. John, you want to talk about that fish for a second?
Yeah, that was a special one. Let's see, fishing in the evening, kind of low light. I'll not discuss where that is, but you know what's crazy, and at some point I'll release this video. But I was fishing with my buddy Rick. We were the last 15, 20 minutes of the day. We saw some fish starting to boil. I actually set up a GoPro when it kind of felt like it was going to go down, and literally like 2 casts later, I hooked this thing. So I actually got the whole GoPro footage of this fish. It was weighed 43 pounds. I hooked it up at the top of a slot, and it ran I probably landed a quarter mile from where I hooked it. Just a fantastic fish. I have caught one bigger than that, but that was a special fish, and I was stoked to have it with a good buddy there. And we took a couple quick photos and let it go, and off she swam. But yeah, fun fish. I think I had a hatch 7+ on a 9-weight rod, and ate a big Steve Adachi clouser pattern. Steve, who works at Lost Coast Outfitters, ties some great striper flies. So it was one of his rattle clouser patterns that I use it all the time. So yeah, kind of a special fish.
Let's talk about just really quickly, just kind of how you have to change your mentality from a trout angler to a bass angler. Like, what does that transition look like from currents and foam lines, and what you're thinking about as a trout angler, transitioning that to a bass angler? Because I think given our current situation, fishing close to home, bass represent a really great opportunity for a lot of people to get out and fish. There's probably bass within 3 to 5 miles of your house, and so let's try and help people understand maybe how that changes, and you guys can talk about it from a guide, rep, photography standpoint as well.
Sure. Yeah, me and Chuck were talking about this, and I'll kind of go big picture, and those two can jump in. One of the biggest things that I challenged with as a bass angler, and then going into as being a bass guide, was most people in fly fishing's concept of bass is those 2 hours they spend in June, July, and August on their buddy's private pond, and with bass just impaling themselves on basically a popper. And the biggest challenge I had was realizing that fishing for bass was a lot harder than fishing and guiding for trout. Coming up under Costello and listening to Costello talk about it and what he was doing and the things he was paying attention to. And then, there's two moments I kind of are ingrained in my mind. Is one conversation was at John Sherman's house, I don't know, a long time ago, listening to Mike Costello and Bobby Barrick talk about oxygen content variation in different types of weeds. And then another one was when Bobby said, and this was more recent, said that most bass feed 20 minutes a day and that you have 20 minutes to put a bag together. And the depth of analysis and what it takes to catch bass 365 days a year, consistently 8 hours a day, figuring out how to do that when I came from all you have to do is throw a popper out there in June and they just jump on it. That was the hardest thing that I had, and the biggest challenge I had was to learn how complex it is and how actually hard these fish are to catch, when from the fly world we come from an idea of that they're very easy to catch.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that 100% in a lot of ways, and even further, like it seems in the fly world, for years there's kind of been this stigma, with bass, that it's either, like as you're saying, Hogan, an easier pursuit, or even a lesser pursuit, than trout. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, Ryan Williams and I, I'll never forget. It was a long time ago. The rivers were blown out. Him and I, neither of us had any trips because all the rivers were blown out, so there were no trout or steelhead trips, and there just weren't people all that fired up on going and chasing spotted bass and whatnot. And him and I were out fishing, and one of the only boats on the lake, and just crushed fish, had a great time, and we're looking around kind of, half irritated that, not as, not enough people knew about what we were doing out there, to the point where, we weren't able to fill dates and, get trips throughout the, the cold water months. But at the same time, super appreciative for being in that position of, I mean, just like any other angling, you gotta go to know, right? You gotta get out there, challenge yourself, and figure it out. And I mean, that's but I think probably the biggest challenge for me, kind of going, from just angling to guiding, was kind of trying to promote what we do and show how cool it is and how special it is to be out there.
I think one of the biggest challenges as an angler, if you're fishing, these, I guess, more popular fisheries that actually have a fair amount of pressure, is you could be doing the exact same thing 95% of the day. And as Hogan said, and this came from Bobby Barrick, there's a 5% of the day where they actually go crazy and you think you can do nothing wrong. So trying to understand those windows, like when is that magic window? Bobby called it cuckoo time, where all of a sudden they're going to eat your shoe if you throw it in the water, and understanding when those windows are. And as Chuck said, I mean, it comes from time on the water. I mean, and even then, I mean, I remember a day with my buddy Rick where there was a 30-minute window where every big bass in the Delta was eating a pole dancer, and we caught, 25 fish, and most of them were over 4 pounds. And as soon as it started, as quickly as it started, it went away. And then we tried to chase that tide and tried to duplicate that in other spots. And then I literally, it was done, and it was literally a 20-minute window. And then we went back the next day with the same conditions, the same tide, tried to do it an hour earlier or an hour later, and it didn't happen. So, I mean, there's those crazy moments, and those are the moments we live for. Those opportunities, when they come together, it's truly special. And so I think that's the frustrating thing. I think as a trout angler, you can kind of know, okay, the hatch is going to come off at this specific time, or there's no hatch. I'm going to throw an indicator, or I'm going to high stick nymph pocket water, and I can make it happen. But there's times, especially with Florida strain largemouth bass, where they put their bellies in the dirt and they do not want to eat, and there isn't a whole lot you can do about it. But the one thing I have learned to kind of overcome that, and this comes from fishing with some of the best gear anglers on the planet, is that you got to have many arrows in your quiver. There's some days where they want a reaction bite, and you can strip a topwater fly super fast. There's other days where their bellies are in the dirt and you have to dangle something right in front of them. The float and fly technique is super effective for that. And then there's other times where, the wind's blowing and they want some sort of a little propeller on your fly. And that's a magic window that you need to understand. And so having multiple arrows in the quiver has been like a game changer for me. Because when I first started fishing the Delta, when I moved here, I fished in the 90s, but when I moved here, it was really when I started targeting the largemouth bass. We threw a Dahlberg diver with a floating line in shallow water, and we had our windows where we did great, but there was a lot of times where that's not what they wanted. And if I would have had other arrows in the quiver to throw at them, you could kind of decipher and crack the code. And every day there's a different code to be cracked. And so having those different techniques, the different setups ready to roll, that's been a game changer for me. And the gear guys they're competing for hundreds of thousands of dollars often in a tournament. So that competition breeds innovation. And I think in a lot of ways they just have all these tools and different techniques. And so being able to adapt those types of techniques to our fly equipment has been one of the funnest things for me. But it's also part of the challenge and part of the reason we love to do what we do.
Yeah,
I would agree with John. I was thinking back, listening to what John was saying, is there, as a trout guide, when the PMD hatch and comes off on the sack, or the egg drop hits on the sack, it's like you kind of figure out where the reds are, you figure out what they want this year, and then you are on cruise control for like 2 to 3 weeks while they're chowing PMDs or smashing eggs. And it is, some days are better than others, but like you got it figured out. Every day striper guiding, I got 3 weather apps open. I'm staring at barometers. I'm watching temperature gauges. I'm watching all this stuff because every day is a different deal. And I think listening to John and Chuck, the biggest thing I've noticed is with bass species is the kind of intricate nature that they are in tuned with their environment too. You got to look at the top, John deals with tides. I don't know a tide chart from a Picasso, but barometric pressure, the interaction of this species with its surrounding is incredibly detailed compared to, say, from when I was guiding for trout, where it was like, okay, October, they're going to eat beads for like 4 weeks. So we're good. It's a completely different game every day with the bass.
Yeah.
Right on, guys. Let's do a little bass ID for a second. Let's talk about some of the different bass in these pictures and maybe how people might tell a difference from them.
Yeah. Well, I guess for starter, a lot of people, I was talking about the spotted bass. A lot of people don't really know the difference between a spotted bass and a largemouth bass. Just a quick little history lesson. Spotted bass were introduced in the early 70s into the state of California. And they were brought over into just a few reservoirs. Then they kind of magically started appearing in all the reservoirs. But the main difference, kind of defining feature that you can usually tell right away is where their jaw hinges. Largemouth, the jaw is going to hinge kind of behind the eye, giving it a larger mouth. Spotted bass, it hinges more kind of in the middle, right behind the eye, giving it a smaller mouth. They also have a tooth patch. There's a few different features, but you guys want to take another one? Go for it.
I'll talk largemouth bass. So there's 2 major strains of largemouth bass, and before I go into that, all the fish that you see up here are under the black bass umbrella. So these are all black bass species. So we have a smallmouth bass on the far right, and on the far left, a spotted bass, which Hogan looks like. Is that you, Hogan? Who is that? Who is that holding the spotties?
Ryan, Ryan.
Okay, got it. And then with my dog, there is a largemouth bass. So there's northern strain, which are from kind of the northern Midwest, and then there's Florida strain largemouth bass. You really, looking at them, can't tell them much apart. The Florida fish tend to be more finicky but get bigger, and then the northern strain fish tend to be more aggressive, feed a little more aggressively, and they don't get quite as big. And then there's obviously interbreeding between the two, but the Florida strain bass were introduced into California in the kind of mid 80s, early 80s. And, many of the biggest bass ever caught on gear and flies have come from Southern California reservoirs where these Florida strain largemouth bass are eating stock trout and getting to enormous sizes. And there was a whole kind of swim bait revolution in Southern California chasing these fish, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and that continues today. But we have both the northern and Florida strain fish in California, and again, you can't really tell the difference by looking at them. But if it's a giant bass, usually anything over 10 pounds, it's going to be a Florida strain fish.
We have a couple different strains of spotted bass as well. The 2 that were brought over, we have an Alabama strain and we have a Kentucky strain. And typically the Alabama strain is the one that a lot of people see, those monsters that, come out of some of these foothill reservoirs and grow a little bit bigger than them Kentucky strain bass.
And then I think one of the important, if you're fishing environments where there are spotted bass and largemouth bass, to the untrained eye, it can be pretty difficult to tell the difference. As Chuck mentioned, the jaw line is one. Both the smallmouth and the spotted bass have a smaller mouth than the largemouth. And if you put your thumb inside the mouth of a spotted bass and rub the tongue, they actually have some teeth, like abrasive teeth, that you can quickly determine the difference between the two. Largemouth tongues are smooth.
Yeah.
And then to make matters more confusing, there's hybridization that occurs between smallmouth bass and spotted bass, which I guess are called mean mouths. And we see that in a number of the reservoirs as well as in the Delta as well. We definitely see, smallmouth looking bass, but that have a distinctive lateral line on them.
Nice. The one in the far right, is that a smallmouth?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, even with the bat, in specific, you can have different colorations on specific bass. And they're kind of tricky to tell apart. All right, so let's do how to be any more comments on bass, on the species? I do have one question that kind of relates to this. Is how do you tell the difference between a male and a female striper? Any comments on that?
Well, I mean, that's a tough one. Cut them open. I mean, as far as I know, a lot of those monsters that you see, some of these ones, Sherman's holding, like, typically will be a female. But there's accounts of some huge males, getting caught as well. When they're younger, as far as I know, it's tougher to tell. I mean, like, as far as we know, females, they're getting ready to spawn not until they're, what, John, 5 pounds at 24 inches or so?
Yeah, 24 inches or 6 or 7 years old is when they reach a point that they're mature enough to spawn. I mean, I've talked to biologists about that exact question, and unless they're cutting them open or it's in the spring months where they're in the spawn mode where you see either milk coming out of the fish or eggs, there really isn't a good way to determine the difference. But in general, the larger fish do tend to be females.
All right. So now we're going to jump into some seasons and seasonality of bass fishing. If you're sort of a entry level bass angler, you probably spring and summer months are your jam. But we'll just kind of talk about how different bass and how you're thinking about bass these different seasons. And so we'll start with the season we're currently in, which is spring. If you guys want to comment about what type of bass fishing you're searching out right now. It might be everything.
Yeah. I mean, spring it's easy to be a bass angler in spring, as we kind of are in the current situation, like if it's got water in it, it's probably got bass in it, and it's worth going to figure that out in the spring. I know for John, and Chuck and me, we kind of, we stay close to home and fish our fisheries close to home that are good. So, I fish the river, the lower Sac for, spring largemouth and smallmouth and stripers. And then I fish Orville for spring bass there as well. And then, there's a bunch of little ponds and stuff. Just like John, chasing bass on golf course ponds. There's a bunch of stuff that I won't say I sneak on anymore, because now that I have kids, people think that's cool, so they'll let you on those ponds now because you're toting a little cute 9-year-old. But that I start hitting up. So, spring's easy.
Yeah, for the foothill lakes, it's nice. That's kind of, the lakes start to turn over, the water starts to get warmer, bass start to move up closer into the shallows. They're already kind of, if they haven't already, they're beginning, to get in that spawn mode. And, this time of year, in a lot of our foothill lakes, we see beds getting built already. And, you'll find some of the bigger fish up in the shallows. Another great thing about the spring and the foothill lakes, especially when it comes to, the kind of lakes that are within and around canyons, ravines, and whatnot, we get a lot of creeks. We get a lot of, and at the same time, we got rain, we got snow melt. So the creeks start gushing, and the creeks start flowing. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's like a magnet for, all these fish. They come, it's a food source. There's food dumping into the reservoir. There's oxygen, there's flow. And it's pretty cool. The bass, in a lot of ways, almost take on a lot of characteristics that any other species you would find in current would be. A lot of characteristics of, say, trout or even striper, where some of these creeks will dump a heavy flow in, create seams and create little eddies and ambush zones. That's we always get excited about that. A lot of our reservoirs, the temps are a little bit different, so it kind of depends on what the temperatures are doing. And there's some of them where, if I was there right now, I would be throwing big feather game changers, or, fishing basically the same type of clouser setups that I would if I was fishing for striper. And then there's some that the float and fly thing is still just absolutely crushing fish. And it's also that time of year where, you've got a good shot at sticking a pig, on that method too. So
I would just add, like, for the Delta where I live, and it's my kind of home fishery, spring's the best time of the year. I mean, March, April, into early May, when the bass are coming off of the winter, the water's cold, they're really lethargic, water temps are warming up, they're moving shallow. It's your best chance to catch a big bass in the pre-spawn mode, which is kind of what we're in now. The weather is usually schizophrenic, which it has been this year. So fish start to move up, then they go back down. But if you want to catch a big bass, a largemouth bass on the fly, I've been trying to chase a 10-pounder, and this is the time of year to do it. This fish on the screen here was a 9-pound fish. It was not on a bed. It was up in the shallows starting to cruise. And, I'm looking for that size fish this time of year. And then the hard part in all that is that it's often the best season to catch stripers too, down here in the Delta. The bigger fish from the bay are coming in through the system. So you got a chance at a giant, pre-spawn striper as well. So the hard part for me is trying to figure out which bass to target right now, because I'm always bouncing back and forth between stripers and largemouth in this window. But that's one of the cool things, especially about the Delta and the rivers and the lakes, is like you can do both in the same day. I mean, there's lakes where there are stripers and bass, and you could kind of, if the bass bite is a bit off or the tide goes flat, like that's one of my favorite things to do in the Delta is when the tide goes slack. There's something about that tide switch when it goes from bottom of the low, starts coming in, or the top of the high, and it starts going out. That often triggers that magic cuckoo time window that Bobby was talking about. So that's often not the best time to striper fish either, because there's often not as much current movement. The current's not moving around bait fish as much, so your striper windows kind of slow down. So having that versatility to do both in the same day, it's what the spring's all about for me, and then to target a trophy.
And then just to put that into context too, with a little bit more, your local bass pond, same concepts apply. As we're going from winter, cold weather, the temperatures are changing that lake, and those fish are going into spawning mode. And so, all the reservoirs around us, those bass are moving into the shallow water from the deep water, which is typically warmer in the winter months, and they're moving into the shallows where it's starting to warm up as that thermocline changes. So bass become much more accessible this time of year.
Yeah, spring. I was gonna say, and it is from like an angler's point of view. Spring's one of the few times you don't need a boat. Like you can catch a lot of fish just stalking the bank on a pond or a reservoir. It's a good time to get into it.
One last thing to throw out here. So that fish up on the screen weighed 9 pounds, and if you catch that same fish May 15th, it's going to weigh maybe 7.25. Depending on what it just ate. So the fish are heavier than the big females are loaded with eggs. They're putting on their feed bags, getting big to survive the spawn. And then post-spawn, those fish start to feed again pretty aggressively. But she's been in the recovery room. She's a little beat up. Her fins aren't as pretty, and she's lost quite a bit of weight. So that's the other thing, is that's one of the other reasons to target those bigger fish then.
Going back to what Hogan was saying about being a great time of year for targeting off of a bank, for anybody listening, on the Cal Bass Union website, Ryan Williams has some great videos on targeting spotties and some of our bass up in the foothill lakes from the bank. And they're definitely worth have a look-see. Yeah.
Cool. Shifting gears to summer, how are we thinking about bass in summer months?
For Chuck and I, summer, pretty much June, we're basically river striper fishing, 5-6 days a week. Our river striper season somewhat is kind of the opposite of the Delta, where March, April into May are pretty slow outside of the migratory run of fish. If you want to go down to like Calusa area, or Yuba City, Verona, that area. For our resident fish, our fish that actually live in the river, June, July, and August, we're basically targeting stripers only, I guess. I don't really do any largemouth or smallmouth fishing this time of year, because our river stripers, the hotter the weather, usually the better the fishing, and we get some pretty hot weather in summer. So yeah.
Kind of May June is pretty stellar in the foothill lakes for for smallmouth, for smallmouth and some of those bass. But there's some drawbacks to some of these beautiful places that we fish, and that's that they get incredibly crowded when the weather gets super nice. A lot of these foothill lakes are beautiful, awesome places for family gatherings and getaways. We have a lot of boat-in campsites. Houseboating is extremely popular, and you can fish for the bass all through the summer, but it starts to, like, May, June is an awesome time to be out there throwing deer hair frogs up into timber, throwing poppers early in the morning. Typically my program that time of year is super early in the morning, getting out there first light. Sometimes we're putting down our first cast at 10 minutes to 5 a.m. I mean, it's super early, and we'll fish poppers until every shadow is gone off the lake. And you can just, once you kind of know where the sun rides and everything, you can chase those shadows and have success on poppers. As soon as the lake is lit up and it's full of sun, you can switch over and go deep. Bass are in the shallows. A lot of it's very, very sight oriented. If you're not spotting a fish and casting to it, you'll most likely see the take often you'll see that eat, which is part of the joy of it as well. That around that same time is when, the crawdads start molting as well. And that's a awesome bite to be on. That's kind of like, as John was saying, kind of cuckoo time that just sometimes goes all day long, like in the foothill lakes when they're on those soft-shelled crawdads, But like Hogan said, it seems like as soon as we start getting into June and a lot of those holiday weekends, and the lakes start filling up with campers and jet skiers and skiers, I'm out chasing for striper anyhow, and trying to avoid those crowds. But yeah.
Down in the Delta, summer. So the water temps really start to crank up. We're looking at water temps in excess of 80 degrees in a lot of places, especially down south in the Delta where I live. So the most adult stripers can't tolerate water temps much above 70. So they're up in the rivers where Hogan and Chuck are fishing them, or they're out, in the salt where George is beating them up in the surf. So the striper game is kind of done here, but then it's all about top water. We're fishing early in the morning, late in the evening, before the bikini and wakeboard hatch occurs, which usually starts around 11 a.m. and goes until dark. But that first hour of light, the last hour of light is magical. Truth be told, mostly in the summer, I'm on the road. I'm in Arizona, or I'm in, traveling throughout California, Arizona, Nevada. So I don't get to do a ton of it. But when I do, it's usually I'm staying close to home, running the bass boat out and fishing the first hour or last hour of light is ideal. We also get a phenomenon that occurs when it gets super hot. We get those 100+ degree days. The bass seek shelter under weed mats and algae mats. And so you fish a fly called the KDM rat over the top of that vegetation. And these bass will blow up through the vegetation, eating either a frog or a mouse or a bird. And it's really exciting grabs, low percentage game because, the gear guys are using super heavy duty meat sticks with 65-pound braid. And we're using trying to throw a 10 weight with 30-pound test and stretchy fly lines and rods that are designed to cast, not extract fish out of heavy cover. But it is some super fun fishing then. And then it's the smallmouth time. Smallmouth spotted time of the year in the North Delta. So I love to run up north of Rio Vista, launch my jet boat up there and bang the banks. Much more consistent fishing than the largemouth game. They bite throughout the day pretty good. And they're not nearly as big. A Delta largemouth, we can expect to catch 1 to 5 pounders pretty consistently. Up there, you're looking at a lot of 8-inch to a giant's like an 18-incher pushing 3 pounds, 4 pounds. But that's our summer mode down here in the Delta.
Yeah, and I'll put that in context a little bit with what's going on here in the Bay Area. And I'll reverse back to spring. I'm trying not to talk too much because you guys know way more about this stuff than I do. But the spring months in the Bay, that's when we get usually our first push of fish somewhere in March coming into the Bay, coming out of the Delta, and really starting to show up. April starts to get really good, in May even better. And then as we go into the summer, a lot of the bigger fish are going to go out to the Pacific Ocean to seek more food, cooler temperatures, and that's when we'll be targeting the beaches and like call it all the way up to Tomales Bay, down to Santa Cruz, and that the beach fishing is really good, and down south all the way down to Monterey and that. So that's kind of in context of the Bay Area striper game. And of course the reservoirs all around us have largemouth and smallmouth that are great fun to target and fish well spring and summer months, with or without a boat. Fall and winter, things start to get a little trickier. Fall and winter for the bass game. Who wants us to kick us off there?
Yeah, I mean, I will. Like, fall and winter's awesome for us. The foothill lakes. The cool thing about spotted bass is they have some different characteristics. Take on uh, than largemouth and even smallmouth. When this water gets cold, and I mean, when I say cold, I'm talking anywhere from 50 degrees down to 37 degrees. Um, these spotted bass will still ride higher in the column. It's more so sometimes than largemouth or even smallmouth. The fall and the winter, and this is more winter, I guess, that I'm talking about. If I back up a little bit, like fall, typically these bass are getting ready for winter. They're fattening up. They're feeding pretty aggressively, pretty heavily. In our foothill lakes, it's a great time to be out. You can still fish topwater in the morning. Typically the water's still warm enough, up against some of these, steep rock walls that you see in this picture here. You can rip feather game changers, small streamers or large streamers, clousers, whatnot, on sinking lines, and I often fish a lot of the same type of stuff, just, downsized in weight a little bit than I would for striper. I fish, like, for our spotted bass, I fish mostly 7 and 8 weights. As far as the sinking lines, though, they're a lot alike. I'll fish anywhere from, an intermediate line, type 3s or type 7s, depending on where the fish are willing to come up to, or where we find them sitting. These, as you get into the colder water months, the fish seem to pot up a little bit more. They're not as spread out, so you'll find them like concentrated in spots, and we'll move along. If you're hunting a wall, for instance, you'll move along the wall and it's nothing, and then you may bang 8 fish in one spot, and then you carry on, nothing, and then you'll hit 6 in one spot. Like, they're very much potted up. And for us, honestly, fall and winter, as the water gets colder, especially with these spotted bass, it doesn't really slow down. Now, as far as the size of fish, it seemed to find the larger spots in the and this is from a fly perspective. We find the larger spots in the spring and fall months. As you get into the winter, some of those larger fish, they get deep, they hunker down a little bit deeper, and they are accessible. It's attainable from a fly rod, but it's a completely different mindset. You're throwing out often a heavy sinking line. You're waiting for a long time, for it, because these fish are, I'm talking in the, anywhere from the 28 to 45 foot range. So very almost similar to fishing, say fishing for saltwater fish over a rock reef, over a rock pile, and whatnot. But the strip, and which we'll get into later, is completely different. But yeah, I mean, that's our fall and winter. It can be as busy as you want it to be out there sometimes. So.
Down in the Delta, fall and winter are, great times to be out here. Once the water temp starts dropping, the threadfin shad, other bait fish start to ball up, school up, and so the fish move more from shallow water, bird, mouse, eaters to really focusing on bait. So this is when a lot of the guys that are striper fishing, throwing Steve Adachi, flashtail clousers, start to tend to catch largemouth bass accidentally. In fact, there was a largemouth that was 18 pounds something, caught in the early 2000s by an angler out of Stockton, caught on the fly while striper fishing. So there's some giants to be had then. And then it's prime time for stripers. Like, your water temps have cooled; they're coming in from the bay. Some are coming down from the rivers, and you're getting some good topwater fishing happening then. And you have the ability to do both kind of throughout the entire winter month. In my world, once January comes around, the fish get pretty lethargic. You can still go out there and get them. You can still catch a big one. But basically January through mid-February, if I'm not up fishing with Chuck and Hogan, I'm with George watching the flows, looking for the eel to come down, or I'm thinking steelhead at that time of year myself. But great time to fish the Delta. They do get way more focused on bait, and so you can catch both stripers and largemouth in the same type of water, which you don't get at other times of the year.
My fall and winter on the river, fall is probably one of my favorite times to fish the river. All our valley rivers see, king salmon runs, and king salmon runs and king salmon anglers push a lot of our resident stripers to the banks. And so we see a lot of sight fishing opportunities in the fall. We see a lot of eyeline type of fishing as our stripers are, up against the bank, staying out of the way of the jet boats and the schools of king salmon coming through. Our catch rates, like the numbers of fish we catch, usually will go down a little bit in the fall, but that's also when we get some of our biggest fish. That's when we see we see big fish year round, but it seems to be a little bit more common in the fall. And then traditionally the sack, where the sack and the feather in the areas I guide for stripers on the rivers, those rivers will traditionally blow out for good during the winter in about right around middle of November. And so after that, I'm on Lake Orville fishing for the spots like Chuck was talking about. So
right on. So we got some couple questions. Some folks submitted questions early here, and we'll get to some of the questions that have already been asked. But if you're listening, you should be able to ask a question there. We'll try and get to as many as we can. But this one comes from Michael Waltman. He says, one of the biggest challenges of transitioning from trout river fishing to Delta bass fishing is understanding what to look for in terms of likely places fish hold. For example, any trout fisherman knows foam lines, seams, funnel food, thus is great places to fish. Quick changes in depth are also great for trout and steelhead. Fish the hell out of the mats and toolies, but have no clue if that's a good place or not. Goes one direction in the morning and the opposite in the afternoon. It's totally overwhelming. So maybe John is the best person to.
That's all sure.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's super. I mean, especially the tidal component to it is super intimidating. The Delta's got 1,200 navigable miles. Where do you even begin? I get it. The first thing I'll say is that Delta largemouth bass are basically everywhere. Like, they're all over every single place you think there should be a bass. More than likely there is a bass there. The population is super healthy. There's tons of them. I think the bigger thing to start, I think as a striper angler, we're thinking about current. Like, which way is the current going? Is it incoming? Is it outgoing? The more important thing to think about for the largemouth game is elevation. It's the height of the water, because you could have, the same height on an outgoing or an incoming tide. So, depending on the time of year, especially when they start getting shallow, I would say, from March 1 through mid-October, those fish are in 1 foot to 6 feet of water. They're in tight to structure. And I've read that a largemouth bass in its entire life won't move more than 100 yards or down the bank. So that if you have a big bass encounter, more than likely he's still there unless a bass angler catches him, weighs him in a tournament, and relocates him somewhere else. But once you kind of understand the depth that the fish are keying in, and mostly it's shallow. When I'm fishing the Delta with the fly, it's a floating line 95% of the time. I'll fish an intermediate line a little bit, which I'm targeting water depths maybe 4 to 8 feet, a little bit deeper. And then I'll occasionally throw a type 3 for those like 6 to 10 foot areas. But shallow water, any kind of structure, tules, wood, rocks, I mean, the fish will live in those areas. The more important thing is trying to determine when they're going to feed. And I really like the tide switches. That's if I'm just starting to try to figure out if I'm fishing an area that I know has fish in it, is trying to determine when those fish will bite. And the tide switch is a really good time to start.
Nice.
Yeah. I mean, I'll add a little bit to that. It's, when I moved out from Florida, like the Delta was super overwhelming right away, but until I kind of had to switch my thinking as the same that it was as when I used to fish for redfish and trout and the, in the Gulf, inshore in the Gulf, being kind of tidal areas. The only difference is instead of, oyster bars and whatnot and sandbars is Thule Islands and whatnot. But, I mean, I'm reading this question here and the first thing I saw is, the trout fisherman knows that foam lines and seams funnel food and are great places to fish. Well, that works the same way in the Delta at times. There's seams, there's currents, there's little eddies and spots like those ambush zones that I found success in for sure. But yeah, I mean, almost looking at it and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but looking at it more so from a river perspective at times, and as far as where that food is coming from, where it's going to, in a lot of ways, can lead you to where they're sitting,
Yeah, I mean, when I'm reading this, changes of depth, current going one way or another way. That's all good things for bass too. It's if the current's going one way in the morning, that's just which way is it funneling the food. And I thought this was a great shot. This is a huge funnel, and that's all food, and the mud's all cover, and so the fish are looking for cover and food just like any other fish that's trying to eat. So.
I'll add to that. I took this photo. So we catch largemouth and stripers off of the spot. And at times those fish are up in the cut like itself right there in the break and the levee. This is a typical Delta area where you've had a flooded island that has been reclaimed by the Delta. And you have all these breaks in the levees, which is what this is. So this spot we catch stripers in. We'll catch them on the outside where the water's flowing in. You can see the color change in that deeper water. So as Chuck was mentioning, I mean, the food is being funneled right to those striped bass. The largemouth, we can't catch a largemouth here until the tide switch, and they all come up onto this little cut and they live right in there. And I on this spot a few weeks ago, in 8 casts, I caught 6 largemouth between 3 and 5 pounds, and they all came up and they fed for 20 minutes, and then it was over. And then you go on and try to find the next spot. Or if you have the ability with the boat, you can run and chase that tide again in a different area. And that's, I think that's one of the keys about the Delta is once you learn what mode that they're feeding on, when it is, and again, those tide switches are key, then you can then duplicate that by running further east and get that exact same tide in a similar spot. And so a lot of the really good gear anglers and fly anglers, I guess, have adopted that and continue to kind of duplicate that same scenario in multiple locations.
Right on. So another caller says, can you discuss fly presentation and direction when fishing striper and current? It seems like it's always been easy to hook striper when they're boiling, but when they're suspending below the surface in heavy current, does it matter to strip the fly up current, across current, or with the current?
I'll take this one. I fish in the river. I mean, we're basically fishing. That's all we fish is current. I mean, even though we do fish a lot of flat water, it's always moving to some degree. I have found over the years that, if you take it from a trout approach, you want a dead drift to a nymph coming down a seam. A stonefly traditionally does not swim up river. A 6-inch bait fish usually does not power Finding Nemo up river either. So I tend to find that when there's current involved for stripers, they want that fly coming to them down the current. It's tough. You got to strip like a son of a gun. But I tend to find that in my guiding and fishing, as soon as that fly starts tracking up the current, a lot of the times it's game over for my stripers. That doesn't look natural to them, I don't think.
Right on.
I'll add a little bit there. I think there are like maybe it's the steelheader in me that likes the swing. Like I'll cast, up and across, get that fly to come down, and I think there is something to, like in a steelhead environment where that fly is down at its deepest point and then starts to lift. I think stripers will see that as a bait fish that recognizes there's a predator there to start to swim away. So that kind of lifting motion and swinging motion of the fly. But Hogan's right. Like when that thing starts charging upstream, which is totally unnatural, that isn't the way to do it. But I think in a up and across, down and across, swinging type motion, and then pulling the fly back when you get the soft current on the inside is a productive way to do it too, both in the Delta and in the rivers that we fish. I mean, I've seen that work quite a bit.
Nice.
I'll agree with that.
There's a question. Chuck, you agree with that?
I agree with all of that. Yeah. Especially when it comes to fishing for them in clear water. There's times where, the sack, the feather, like the Yuba, like the American, I mean, where the water can get pretty clear. And a lot of people, may not realize like striper, they can be super spooky fish. They can be line spooky, the motor spooks them, so, sometimes that swing presentation that John's talking about, that downstream or swing presentation is the way to get them. But it is a fine line. You're not, trucking it upstream, like that. It's more of kind of, as you would imagine, just a fleeing bait fish that's coming out of a scary zone into the current, but yeah, I agree with all of that for sure.
And in the swing, it's often, in the steelheader, you're not moving the fly, you're making a mend, you're getting it down there, you're holding on. And I think as a striper angler, when you're swinging the fly, there's a lot of like twitching of the fly, just kind of embarking some movement to it. So you're pausing it. You're not necessarily stripping inline. You're just kind of twitching it and making that thing look more alive.
Like a shad.
Yeah, but maybe a little more aggressive than a shad twitch.
Cool. What about, so we talked a little, Chuck, you just touched on clear water. We got another question about, muddy water. Is there any specific like searching patterns or any philosophies that you follow? And Jason follows up that he's 3 deep on hazy IPAs and that this rules. So
I'll get really thirsty about you guys.
So one thing I'll take that one because there's an interesting thing. So I grew up guiding with Costello, and Costello swears by rattles and flies for off-color water. The river environments that we fish, off color water is kind of a weird deal. Like, we catch fish in very dirty water, but the flies that we catch fish on in dirty water don't change drastically from the flies that we catch fish on in, say, not dirty water. What changes is our fish, for some reason, I've never had really good luck with rattles in dirty water on the river. What's interesting is the migratory fish in the spring will eat rattles in dirty water, but our resident fish traditionally don't eat rattles. They don't like them. It doesn't make that much of a difference. What makes a difference is the bulk of the fly, how much water that fly pushes. And it could be chartreuse and white, it could be black and purple and chartreuse, but it's size. It's got to be big, it's got to push water, they got to be able to find it. And that's the big thing for me when it comes to clear versus off color water. It's not so much a color or a rattle, it's how much water that fly pushes.
Well, that's true in the Delta too. I mean, you need a fly that's like, stripers feed by sight, by scent, but most importantly, they feed with their lateral line. They can sense and feel a wounded or injured bait fish. I've seen in clear water environments fishing on the American, I've seen stripers track the fly 60 feet. So how often is that happening in dirty water environments or places where we can't see? So I think, and this is definitely a tip from Costello. The color in the Delta that works best in dirty water is black over purple over chartreuse. Those three colors in the fly together. There's something about that combination that they can pick up and sense well with a rattle. George has them there at the store. Steve Adachi ties a rattle clouser in those color combinations, and that's my go-to for stained or off-color water. I'll often stall the fly a little bit more, knowing that they can't see it as well, so just making sure it's easier for them to find. So on the retrieve, which we haven't really talked a whole lot about, there'll be a little longer pauses they'll tend to incorporate in the retrieve to get them to go. But a flashtail whistler is a really good one for that environment. It has the big collar that pushes a ton of water, creates more turbulence in the water, and it's easier for those fish to pick up. So I'll just add that.
Chuck, you just got a grunt.
No, I agree. I mean, I like those dirty, that black over purple over chartreuse for sure is a go-to. Dark rust, like any of those dark colors. I mean, I was always definitely, but I agree. At the same time, I agree with what Hogan said. I've run out of those flies and hadn't had any choice but to throw on something lighter color in dirty water, and it still works. So, it's hard to say, I probably fish some more rattles in the river than Hogan probably does, but not always. I mean, I'm definitely agree with him in the sense that I've wondered. I used to think that it had to have a rattle, and then I ran out of flies with rattles, and it didn't matter. So, it's kind of, so.
Nice. So next question here is moon phases, barometric pressure changes. How does that affect bass? What are your thoughts on this? I think we've touched on it a little bit, but any more expounding on these philosophies?
Yeah. I mean, we like in the rivers often, we like before full moons. We've traditionally done well around new moons as well. I'm reading this question right now for trout, low pressure and full moon shut the bait. Yeah, well, for bass, bass seem to like low pressure. They seem to kind of slow down when that pressure gets high. As far as the moon phases, I mean, there's no doubt about it. These fish, when you got a big moon, these fish are eating they're eating through the night, striper hunt from underneath. So, if you got a lit up sky, anything that swims above that head, they're seeing that thing pretty well. So there's no doubt about it, but we do well before full moons. Yeah.
I'll just add to this. It's been my experience, definitely like in the Delta here, stripers mode. Like when you get a cooling pattern where it goes from warm to cold, that'll shut them down big time, especially the largemouth bass. And then on the striper side as well, there's definitely like when that barometer is dropping, they'll often go off the grab. But then once the system kind of shows up and the rain is there, I absolutely love fishing in the rain. And Californians are wussies in a lot of ways. They don't like to fish in the rain, and like literally the Delta could have there'd be 100 trailers at a popular ramp in the summer, and then if you get a little bit of rain, there'll be 10 trailers, maybe 5. Like Californians just don't like to fish in the rain. And so I've had outstanding fishing when the storm is upon us and it's going off and the wind's blowing, the rain's coming in sideways. I mean, the fish often, they go crazy. The cuckoo time expands and you could have some great fishing in that environment.
Yeah. I'll add even a little bit more to that, kind of going again back to the cold water season that we fish for these spotties, and some of our better days happen on the nastiest days. When there's rain and there's chop and there's current, the creeks are gushing and it's nasty out. Those spotties react well to that, and we welcome it for sure.
So I think this is a important topic, and I think one that is probably one of the most important things when we're talking about fishing for bass is the strip. And so just quickly talk about stripping techniques. I got a little video here. See who's going to guess first. Can anybody guess who this is stripping by the first shot here?
That's Costello. No doubt.
No doubt.
There you go. So there's Costello's going to be pissed for showing off his strip.
No man wears a sun shirt like that.
So, hopefully that video translated through. You can kind of see the snappiness of the strip. Steve Adachi sent me that one, but you see the distinct pauses as well. But do you guys have comments on stripping for spots and stripers and largemouth and how that might differ?
I mainly strip for the stripers, and our fish, I'd say most of the time, want the fly moving as fast as you can move it. Based, I think, on the fact that we're fishing, our fish's windows are a lot smaller to grab prey in river and behind snags and flats and such than maybe in the Delta. They don't get as much reaction time. I don't know. I don't fish the Delta really at all, but one thing that I've clued myself into, and I learned this hanging with Mikey and coming up with him, I coordinate my strip with my line. John said one thing about in dirty water pausing your fly. And one thing I didn't say is in dirty water, I fish lighter lines because I know I'm going to be moving my fly slower. So I want to keep that fly. A lot of people, they throw on their striper line and they fish the same strip with every line. I vary my lines a lot with my strip to keep flies in certain water columns at certain speeds. But overall in the river, we move our flies pretty fast most of the time. When the water's cold, gets a little colder in the fall and into the winter, we definitely slow down. And for spots, Chuck can talk to that. I don't do that game.
Yeah, there's a lot of it's same but different, and again, it depends on the temps. In the fall when the fish are fattening up and they're kind of feeding heavy, and you're finding them in that, like, anywhere from along these rock walls, anywhere from 2 feet deep to 12 feet deep, or if they're deeper, they're coming up to it. The my key from either if I'm fishing or whether it's clients, like, you have to move that fly and flash it, but the most important thing is after you move that and flash it aggressively, right, you get tight again right away. So in other words, always staying connected, always feeling the end of your fly, because I've seen it time and time again in super clear water, both striper and spotted bass, where I've seen the fish rush, advance on a fly, suck it in, spit it out, just like that. Just poof, like, suck it in, spit it out. And like, hey, Cassix, what's up, buddy? Yeah. Often, and I'm sure a lot of people have done this if you've striper fished, pauses are key. They eat it on the pause often, when that fly's dropping. But often, you'll be stripping aggressively and then you'll just pause, right? Well, if you're not hanging onto your line, or you're not staying connected with what's happening, that fish can advance on your fly, eat it, push your leader and line forward to you, to where you may feel that strike a little bit too late if you're not seeing them. So, the most important thing, like when I'm stripping for the spotties, if, say, we're calling it fishing a type 3 or whatever, and you make that cast and you get it's down to the depth that you want, I like a couple big flashes, and then I like small kind of slow strips coupled with little, kind of jerk twitches and whatnot, but always staying connected, because even, those spotties have like a real subtle bite sometimes when, sometimes they hammer it, sometimes they crush it, but sometimes, and I think this is different than a striper, in the clear water, I've seen the striper come up, hammer it, and then turn around and go back down, right? We've all seen that. Well, I've seen the spotties come up and eat it and stay right there. They just stop. They just come up out of nowhere, eat it, and they just stay right there. So if they come up and they eat that fly, they're pushing your leader and your line forward. If you're not connected, you're not feeling anything, So does that make sense?
Yeah, great point, Chuck.
I'll just add, I've seen it so many times where you have two guys fishing together, same rod, same line, same fly, and one guy catches 30 and the other guy catches 3.
Yeah.
And it's all about the retrieve. The retrieve is
that's like everyday guiding.
That is the most important thing. Like if you can cast, at least, in striper fishing, if you can cast, the further you can cast, the better you'll do, for sure. But the retrieve is absolutely critical. And it depends, one, on the fly, because all flies swim differently. I know, like, if you try to strip a game changer the same way you strip a clouser, they jackknife, they don't swim right. So you have to change your retrieve based on the pattern, as Hogan said, based on the fly line. But in general, we fish clousers probably more than any other pattern for stripers. The retrieve is what Mike is doing there, is very accurate. I like to throw in a little mini strips too, like hard strips, twitch, pause. Most bass feed when the fly is falling, As Chuck mentioned, line control is everything there. You'll miss grabs if you're not in contact with your fly. You get those that feel like a little tiny leaf had hit your fly, and that might be a giant fish that came up and ate it and kind of came at you. But retrieve is absolutely critical. And in general, as the water temperature cools, the retrieve is the same, except the pause gets longer. You pause. I mean, I've seen it when the water temp in the delta is in the high 30s, and you have to let that fly pause for 5, 6, 7 seconds, which is extremely painful for me. But that is often super effective. So I think what you're seeing there as a general flashtail clouser type retrieve that Mike's doing on a sinking line, that's a pretty good way to do it. What happens a lot is anglers might not be catching fish, and they start looking around and they're daydreaming. And so that hard, aggressive retrieve starts becoming, and they're coming back to their woolly bugger strip, and pretty soon they're just going dink, 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 and they're not paying attention, and they have no chance of getting bit at that point. So you got to stay in the game. You got to believe that every cast is going to be a fish, and you have to, manipulate that fly and change it up, and then figure it out. Like, the pattern changes by the day. Especially on black bass. Like, sometimes they want it super fast reaction type grab. Other times they're laying their bellies are on the mud, and you need to stall the fly more to elicit that grab. Super critical. Presentation is everything in success in bass fishing.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Captain Kyle says weed guards are great and all, but I'm still getting hung up subsurface. Any thoughts or tips on this?
Weed guards are critical in the Delta. I'll take this one first. I mean, in the Delta, we're fishing heavy cover weeds and all that. First thing I would say is your weed guard's probably not heavy enough. A lot of store-bought weed guards are 20-pound test. In the Delta, we use this actually came from the Calico Syndicate guys. We'll use 2 heavy mono posts that are 50, 60 pound, and that's what's required often to get through some of that heavy cover. If you're fishing, I know up in the river, sometimes you're just around trees and stuff, and it's pretty hard to not foul trees. But in the Delta, I mean, I would venture to guess that the weed guard is not heavy enough. You need to go much heavier than you think, because a lot of the commercially tied weed guards out there just don't get it done in the heavy vegetation that we find out in the Delta.
Ryan Williams is, as of lately, or he's been doing a little while, but he's tying some really great striper flies with weed guards, bass flies with weed guards. But yeah, I mean, it in the river most of the time I'm not using them. Most of the flies. Where I don't lose a ton of flies, it's usually the flies that get lost is usually an angler not really paying attention to where their line is, or most of the time though, when we snag trees and whatnot, I risk the tip of the rod and move over to it. And honestly, I do break tips, probably break about a dozen rods a year doing that. But at the same time, I probably save about 350 flies. So, to me, the weighing that out is, I'm happy to buy a few rod tips and not have to tie another few hundred flies. But
yeah, I would agree with Chuck and Sherm. Most of my weed guards that I fish, if I do fish them on the river, are modeled after how the Calico guys do it. Vaughn, Podmore. Vaughn always puts pictures of flies up on Instagram, and they definitely have the weed guard game dialed for those Calico bass.
It's got to be super heavy duty to stand up. A lot of the weed guards that you find in commercially tied flies, they especially, don't stick them in a fly box, or, in a slot. They always tend to foul and fail and whatnot, because most of the ones that I see, just aren't really heavy enough,
Cool. I agree. Good stuff. Let's see here. Without a depth finder, how would you recommend finding structure in open water? Question.
Trial and error.
Man, that photo the first thing that came to my mind is what that photo shows, and that is color of water.
Yeah,
so,
color change.
Yeah, dark water, deep water, lighter water, Yeah. If you can get up above what you're trying to fish, whether it's, even if you can stand on something in your boat and look.
Yeah, but to find structure in open water, it's pretty difficult, if not impossible in some situations. One thing that you could have going for you in doing so is reading the bank. In the foothill reservoirs, if you pay attention to the bank, and when I say the bank, I'm talking about the degree of fall and the degree of the slope. What's on that slope? Is it big rocky boulders? Is it small basketball sized stuff? Sometimes you may see, just the bottom, the root ball of a big tree, follow the direction of that tree to visualize where the rest of it is, right? But as far without a graph, finding structure in open water, I couldn't tell you. But as far as like finding the bank, structure along banks, look for points. Points are always a great place to start. Look at bends. I'm looking at this picture here, and every corner of every elbow of every cove. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very useful. I think looking at the banks is an awesome idea. And in tidal situations, going out at low tide and looking at low tide, it reveals so much structure, especially we have our king tides, our lowest lows, and our highest highs. The most interesting thing for me is going out on those super low tides and seeing what's out there. And I found everything from good structure to people putting things to catch lures and cut lines out in the water, in different spots. So I think that's another quick.
Same with, and if you're in a river situation, running the river, obviously be as safe as you can, but at your own risk. But running the river at a extremely low flow is going to show you a lot of things that normally you wouldn't see otherwise. And same with the foothill lakes. The foothill lakes fluctuate so much. It's insane how much water comes in and out of these places. And you get out on one of these lakes, and when it's really dropped, it's kind of amazing what you see. That you could find fish over later.
Totally. So these are two kind of quick gear related questions. Single hand rod line combinations. Just quickly, let's talk about line systems. There's a lot to go into. We have some videos on YouTube where John Sherman breaks down all of his line systems. I'll send that out to everybody who participated. But let's talk generally weights and kind of your go-to line and rod weight for fishing. What you love to do the most.
I'll start this one first, guys, and then I gotta bounce here. It's my wife's birthday, so I'm on borrowed time.
Yeah.
So, I'll use in my boat. I'll have a 6 weight through a 10 weight. The 6 weight I'll use for smallmouth bass fishing. I'll do a little bit of carping with it, panfish, that sort of thing. The 6 weight is as light as we'll go down here in the Delta. I like a 7-weight for largemouth a lot. I fished a lot of 7s and 8s, but the 7 to me is like the perfect largemouth rod, unless I'm in heavy cover, and then that's where I need to go to an 8 or a 9 or even a 10. When I'm throwing that big surface pattern that we talked about, the KDM rat fishing over vegetation, that's a 10-weight game. That's a bigger game. So yeah, it's 7s, 8s. I have a lot of rods in my boat, and if I wasn't in the fishing business, I probably wouldn't have nearly as many, but I'll often have 13 rods rigged and ready at any one time. I think it's hard to do it with just one. I think you need, changing out flies and spools and different lines becomes cumbersome, and you're wasting time throughout the day. That's one thing I've learned from the gear guys. They'll have 30, 40 rods rigged and ready to go in their boat. So I take a lot of that to heart, and have, instead of changing lines on spools, I'm just grabbing a rod and going. So I think that's a key thing. Striper wise, 8s and 9 weights I think are ideal. Not that you can't handle a striper with a lighter rod, but the size of the flies and the lines that we use require a bigger rod. I think a 9-foot 9 weight is the perfect striper rod for fishing down in the Delta. As far as lines are concerned, I'll have the Rio outbound shorts, the airflow sniper lines, the integrated shooting head style lines are ideal. Straight floater, which is what I'll use for topwater fishing for stripers. The Sage bass line, which is the best bass line ever created, in my opinion, for short, quick, accurate casts for black bass. That line is ideal for topwater fishing for bass. I use it for basically all of my shallow water bass fishing, largemouth bass, not talking stripers here. And then the integrated lines, I'll have floaters, as I talked about. I'll have an intermediate, I'll have a type 3, and then the T14 version. Those 4, again, will be rigged up on any one system and ready to roll. So that kind of gives you that gives you're ready for any environment. If you're fishing in shallow water, doing that retrieve we talked about, and you're throwing T14 in that 2 to 6 feet of water, you're going to be on the bottom immediately. So that's where that intermediate line hovers the fly and keeps it in the strike zone longer. I know there was a question about targeting bigger stripers. I think a lot of anglers in the Delta tend to fish deeper, and a lot of these big fish are found in shallow water. Most of the big stripers I've caught in the Delta have been in less than 4 feet of water. They come up into the shallows to feed. If they're in that type of water, they're there to eat. So I think looking for those shallow water environments and throwing those intermediate lines are ideal. If no one has another question for me, I got to bounce. So,
John, thank you so much, man.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you. Appreciate being a part of this. Yeah. And one last thing. I got 2 things. Support your local fly shop in times like these. There's no better time right now than to shop with George. So I totally say that we're all in this together, what's going on with the COVID-19 thing. And, your local fly shops need your support more now than ever. So highly recommend going in and seeing George. If you can't go in, call him, order something online. Now is the time to do that. And also, secondly, you're going to learn more in one day fishing with a guide like Hogan and Chuck than you will in months doing it on your own. So get in touch with these guys. They are the pros, and they'll help you learn a ton when you're out there fishing. So I highly recommend hiring both of these guys out on the water. Thanks. Appreciate your time. Good night, everybody.
All right. Bye, John.
Yeah, bud.
Just to quickly expound on what Sherman said there, you can see how much that these guys, Hogan and Chuck, are thinking about the way fish are feeding and what they're doing. I mean, you can spend a lifetime trying to track, to figure this out on your own, and or you can go out with them, and you are going to learn so much in hours. It's going to shorten your learning curve, and I take them up on every opportunity, even though sometimes I show up 3 hours late to a guy day.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Now that Sherm's off the call, I will say Sherm carries more gear than anyone I know. So if you are listening to this, don't be intimidated by that list of gear.
Good that we have
in my striper rods, I carry, when I'm guiding, we got 6 rods in the boat, sometimes 8, depending on the time of the year. I would say we fish 9s and 10s on the river. We have some pretty big fish on the river and our fishing current. So in the fall, I pretty much run all 10 weights. Most of the time, though, we're fishing 9 weights. I fish the Scott rods and Echo rods. Kind of have a price point for both people. Not everybody's going to spend $900 on a a striper rod. So I have the Scotts and the Echoes and 9s. Lines. One thing John didn't say is any of this bass fishing where you're stripping flies, having a line that has a braided core is absolutely critical. There's a mono core in a lot of trout lines, which helps that line float usually a little bit better. And then there's a braided core, which is going to have absolutely zero flex to it, which is incredibly important to set the hook on a stripped fly. I fish the sniper lines, just as John said. We're going to have a 7, a 5, and an intermediate line for each guy in the boat in the sniper series. I've experimented with some of the streamer lines and that type of stuff. I know Mikey fishes, and me and him are always going back on those, back and forth. But I tend to keep it pretty simple in those 3 things. For the lake stuff, I'll let Chuck hit that. I would definitely agree with John. My number 1 largemouth rod is a 7 weight. And then I usually have pretty similar line breakdown for if I'm largemouth fishing with the 7 weights.
Yeah. I can agree with all that most of the time, 9s and 10s for striper, even some 8s for striper, but most of the time it's the 9s, and it, like, as Sherm said, it's not that the striper, you couldn't handle a fish on a big fish on a lighter rod. It's the flies, and and also we're fishing in risky environments, and in the sense that you may hook a fish around just a minefield of tree snags, and there's moments where you have to kind of risk breaking that fish off and really put the wood to them. Otherwise, they're gone for sure. And not only the fish, but maybe a fly line as well, So having those heavier rods, I think, are critical. When I'm throwing big game changers, big flies, I'll go up to 10, at least 10, and have fished even 12 weights, 11s and 12s, throwing the big changers and whatnot. In the foothill lakes, like the 7 weight kind of has seemed to be ideal for what I do all around. Most of my foothill bass rods are 7 weights. Every once in a while, we a few 8 weights when we're ripping streamers. I'm going to answer this question. Would a 5 or 6 weight get you in the largemouth game? Absolutely, for sure. Yeah, it would. Get after it. Go do it. It most certainly would. I fished 6s, even 5s, doing the floating fly thing for a long time. But I ended up gravitating to a 7 weight because the thing about these spotted bass, and even with that whole float and fly game and everything, just like any other fishing, the most critical thing is the hook set. But especially in that float and fly game, because it seems like any spotted bass, once they hit that 5-pound caliber, any spot over 5 pounds will head right between your legs under the boat, run down the bank, and run for the hills. They take us into backing, and we've caught enough of them to know that, like, if a fish goes to backing, that's a 5-pound plus fish. That's a 5-pound plus spot, right? Anything less than that, they'll fight, they'll dig, they'll go down. but they'll stay in your zone. But the reason I bring that up is when you get a big one and it runs down the hill and it's all of a sudden you're into backing, for one, it's crucial, try to get that backing back on the reel, get that line back on the reel as soon as you can. We're still fishing 8-pound test to hook those fish at times. But what they can do is they can run deep, and then just make a U-turn, come back up, and you got all this slack in your line. So if you don't get a good hook set from the get-go, that's where they throw it. And, for me, I've kind of gravitated like the 7 weight for those spots has been the best, a little bit stiffer, get a quicker snap, quicker hook set.
I just want to clarify real quick, Chuck, because you're talking about the float and fly, and we haven't really covered that. But essentially, it's using a special indicator that has a sort of a ring on the bottom of it, where we're suspending a balanced minnow below it, right? And we're manipulating the minnow using that float.
Yeah, more or less fishing like a balanced minnow pattern for sure, under a long leader and an indicator. And we, this is originally this is a conventional method for crappie, but it changed and was adapted to fish for lethargic game fish in cold water environments, fishing for bass in cold water environments, when they're not super hot to trot to chase a stripped fly. And that's where I feel a lot of fly anglers get frustrated with bass fishing in the winter. It's slow, you're not catching a lot of fish. Well, usually that's attributed to not slowing it down enough. Sometimes they're not chasing, and the only way to really just, stop on a dime is to suspend it, and now you have this fly just suspended there. It's an easy meal. It's an easy target. They don't have to expend a lot of energy. As the water cools down, everybody knows like the metabolism of a bass slows down. They're not feeding as much, and they're not feeding as often, and they're definitely not moving as far to chase food. So they'll rise to this occasion under the float and fly method. And in a nutshell, we're fishing balanced minnow patterns under leaders that are anywhere from 5 feet deep on down to 15, 16 feet deep.
Right on.
Yeah.
And a lot of these rigs, all the rigs we're talking about, we all have videos on our calbassunion.com breaking them down. So if people want to know more, they can get on there and watch all of us talk about how we rig all our different.
Yeah, Cal Bass Union has some great resources on their website. So sure, there's a lot of great videos on there and great talks. And we'll I'll kick this video out. I'm recording it. We can kick this out and put it on there as well.
We share a lot of the Lost Coast videos on our site as well. It's kind of
this next question would have been a better question for Sherman than Hogan or I.
I can handle it.
Hit it.
Go for it.
In the Bay Area. So we have a ton of reservoirs. I live in the North Bay, so the Mountain Tam watershed and Nicasio, Sujahule Reservoir, Kent Lake, Alpine Lake, Bontempi, as well as the entire bay. So the bay's got our stripers in it, but we also catch carp in the bay. And then Phoenix, Bontempi, Lagunitas, Alpine, and Kent, they all have bass in them, as well as certain ones have stock trout. Nicasio and Sujahule have great bass fishing as well. There's Stafford Lake, Annandale State Park. On the South Bay, I don't really know much on the peninsula. A lot of the reservoirs seem to be closed. The east, all the East Bay reservoirs have bass in them. And are worth checking out. I don't live in the East Bay. I don't really, bass for me is I'm fishing the ones closest to my house. And then I know like Morgan Hill area, the Henry Coast State Park has some great warm water fishing out there. But you know, any of the bass ponds, you know, any pond or lake in your area is worth checking out. I mean, I spent my whole childhood doing that, and you'd be surprised how many of them have bass or crappie or bluegill or something in them. So you won't know if you don't try, and that's the beauty of this, is that it's so accessible, and that was why I thought this would be a great presentation. Is, you know, we shouldn't be traveling long distances to fish right now, and we should be checking out the waters closest to our home, and what a great opportunity to do so. So you know, go to the bottom.
Actually, looking at this map, I actually have a few clients that live in the North Bay that fish. I'm not gonna like out their lakes right on the interweb, but they spend a ton of time on those couple of those lakes that you have pictured there, and they fish all year round.
Yeah.
They started fishing the float and fly with me over the winter a couple years ago, and they're fishing it out there and doing a bunch of stuff. And they always say there's no one there.
Nobody. Yeah.
Literally no one.
I take friends who are new to fly fishing all the time, and I'll take them out to those lakes, and you know, we'll throw frog patterns and just get back, you know, 5, 6, 7 bass blowups in an hour.
Yeah.
It's great. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of lakes and reservoirs that aren't even on this map that are worth checking out. So we do have plenty in the Bay Area. You just need to pull out the maps and start going and checking them out. I think that's it, guys.
Cool.
Really appreciate everybody's time and effort and putting this all together, and everybody for watching. And
Absolutely.
we'll post it online when it's all done. Hogan, Chuck, John, who's gone, thank you so much, man. This was
Yeah, and if people had questions and they didn't get them answered, like email me or Chuck or John. We're happy to answer them for you. We're not super busy right now, so.
I just opened up the. I just saw the Q&A on the bottom, and there's some other questions that came in, and one was, "What's the best sauce for fried chicken on the Sac?" Jim Weatherwax. That'd be South Mouth sauce, buddy.
I'm glad we got that one answered. Well.
Yeah, I'm looking over a few of these. The time frame for catching, is there a time frame? What method of street? Oh yeah, I think we answered most of these.
Yeah, we hit most of these.
Yeah. Somebody asked about walking weight opportunities in the Delta. That's a Sherm question. Most of the Delta fishing that I've done is always in a boat. We cover a lot of water. You know, I know that there are. But I wish Sherm was here to answer that one for you.
I'll put it this way: I've never seen him fish from the shore.
Yeah.
No. But you can rent boats. There's spots to rent boats in the Delta. I don't know how good they are.
I don't know about right now, but Sugar Barge does rent boats. I mean, there are. I mean, anywhere on the Delta, you know, you could fish. I just, you know, it'd be a hard thing to dial in. There's 1,200 miles of shoreline out there. So, you know, if you can get to it, there's probably fish there somewhere.
Yeah. Well, on.
If you have questions, hit us up.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll send this presentation out recorded to everybody. I'll connect everybody with you guys on your websites. I highly recommend booking both of these gentlemen out for a day of fishing. You'll learn a lot, and I'd say do it sooner than later. They both have pretty busy schedules, although not necessarily. You guys are busy right now, but not in the traditional guiding.
No.
But book a day.
Booked up, but keep moving the trips forward. Or they just, we're waiting for the gates to open, buddy.
We'll get there.
But,
well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, George.
See you guys.
Thanks, everybody.